4, 5, 6, great. Call the meeting to order. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Agent.
Here.
Clegg.
Here.
Halliburton.
I see him.
Sanchez.
Here.
Thompson.
Here.
Woodings.
Here.
All present.
Thank you. So today's work session, we have Eric Vilmoria with us to talk about revenue projections to set the stage for the next couple of weeks as we do budgeting and build the budget for ultimately our June workshop. I thought, just Eric, before passing it off to you, I just wanted to say a couple things. You guys have all seen the slides, I trust. I believe that they were sent over yesterday. Tonight, we're going to talk about revenue for the city. And, you know, this is where the impact of the pandemic is real, because we're looking at what has not come in this year that we expected to come in. But more importantly, as we're looking ahead to the next budget, what we expect the parameters will be. You saw in there that I asked staff to model this with a 2% plus growth increase rather than the full 3%. Have also looked at other numbers because I think it's important right now. Even before this, there were so many people in our community that were calling on us to look at how we make cuts if possible, how we help impact housing affordability. And now even more so, we're hearing that. And this isn't, as I've talked with Eric and the department heads and the rest of the finance team, this isn't just about cutting money, but we'll actually be asking the staff to look at and really expect the staff to reprioritize in light of the changes that our community and world have experienced and the importance of investments to rebuild the economy. And so today we're going to talk about what we expect could come in and what that looks like. And they've done a great job already throughout the year setting aside savings so that we could have this conversation about how much we change what we look at in terms of the property tax formula. But then most importantly, they've begun setting the stage for enabling us to make the investments that we need while also being mindful of the impact that it has on the community. And so today, revenue, starting next week and then beyond expenses. But Eric, I really appreciate all the work that you've done, and we'll just ask you to take it from here.
Thank you very much, Mayor. Appreciate the opportunity. I'm happy to be with you all this afternoon. I'm gonna just try and share my screen here. Let's see. And okay, is my screen, you guys can see my screen? Okay, thank you. All right, so what I'd like to do is, before we get into the specifics and the specific recommendations, what I'm going to talk a lot about is where we are today in terms of our recommendations versus where we were back in January. You'll recall that we had a fairly extensive conversation back in January about our revenue estimates. We had gone through, many different scenarios and run through lots of different options. And at that time, the general approach and the general feeling in the economy was that, a recession was not imminent at that time. So what we had done is we had, built our forecast with an allowance for a recession at some point in time, just not necessarily in the immediate term. So what I'll first start with was, we had outlined back in January what some of the recession risks could be. And we talked about the national economy, whether it be the fact that it's an election year, trade concerns were definitely top of mind at that point in time, interest rates, deficits, things of that nature. We also talked about the international economy, and we're so highly interconnected that, when we look at growth rates, around the globe, that has the potential to impact the local economy. The other item we called out, which is really pertinent right now, would be unanticipated events. So when we look at where we are right now, I think all of those factors are definitely applicable, with most certainly the coronavirus issue forcing this right into our laps in the moment that we are right now. So the timing for that recession, which we had built in over the course of the 5-year period, has definitely been accelerated. Also, the degree of the recession, we had modeled back in January, a normal recession, certainly nothing along the lines of the Great Recession. All indicators are that this recession that we probably already are in, could be, as severe or more than the Great Recession. So one of the things we talked about earlier in the calendar year was the fact that even if we do enter a recession, each one of our revenues will behave differently. So when we looked at property tax, we talked about the fact that the main thing that a recession will do would essentially reduce the amount of growth or new construction and annexation revenue that would come into the city. That while that's still true, what we have built in to our estimates, and we'll definitely go through each of these, is an allowance for a higher level of delinquencies. And we've looked at our collection patterns for the last couple of recessions and allowed for some level of delinquencies. When we have a delinquent payment, those payments will eventually come to the city, but they don't fall within the fiscal year for which they were originally anticipated. So it does create a budgetary issue. When we talked about sales tax, when a recession occurs, you look at reduced growth levels over time. Certainly what we're seeing now is the likelihood of more immediate impacts due to coronavirus. We also had this issue with state legislation that was passed this most recent session that essentially changed the formula, the distribution formula for sales tax as it's distributed to cities. And we'll see as we get into the slides that does have an impact in some of our outer years, at least in terms of our projections. Development fees is one that historically we see impacts from very quickly when we enter into a recession. So we have built those impacts in both this fiscal year. We talked about that at last council, as well as for next fiscal year. When we talk about liquor tax, that's been a category that historically we've talked about as being somewhat immune from recessionary environments, and that has historically largely been true. However, you'll see when we get into the specific slide for liquor tax that we're seeing, we're anticipating a larger than normal impact from this recession due to the fact that restaurants and bars are closed, and the mix of receipts that go into the statewide pool for liquor tax is comprised about 25% from restaurants and bars. Franchise and fees, we have not assumed any significant change attributable to this event. And then departmental fees, we most certainly are. And there are a whole host of different revenues that comprise our departmental fees. And some of those impacts are quite immediate. So I did mention that we had based our revenue estimates previously on a number of factors. In January, we looked at historical collections. We looked at the local economic environment. We looked broader at national and statewide trends and economic forecasts. The other thing that we did at that time is we developed we utilized a Monte Carlo simulation. And that's a tool that is helpful to project the impact of a recession when the exact timing is unknown. So in other words, we wanted to assume a recession within the 5-year period. We didn't think it was going to be immediate. So what we did is we essentially feathered it in over the 5-year period. Now our revenue estimates aren't using that Monte Carlo simulation due to the fact that the recession that we had anticipated is likely upon us. So we have based our revenue estimates on historical impacts from prior recessions, on economic forecasts to the best of our ability. And what I'd like to just mention now is going to be a theme that will probably be prevalent throughout this budget process. I think that we're going to need to treat some of our estimates as iterative, and we're going to need to adjust our revenue estimates over time as more information becomes available. This really is, uncharted territory, and we are, doing our best to assign, different revenue estimates, knowing that the duration of this event, the severity of this event, and the implications from a whole bunch of different factors will really, determine the level of revenues that we do ultimately receive. And before I get into the specifics, I just wanted to highlight quickly, some early statistics to have in the back of our mind as we're going through the revenue, the revised revenue estimates. So, in the month of March, and a lot of this is not new news, but in the month of March, retail sales, fell dramatically, and many forecasts are calling that when we see the toll for April, it's going to be even worse. So there was an 8.7% decline in the month of March. Manufacturing nationally saw significant levels of decline. Our national jobless claims over a four-week period were 22 million, essentially erasing all of the job gains since the Great Recession recovery. And when we look in the state of Idaho, there were 96,000 unemployment claims since March 13th, which is a greater number than all of last year. Housing starts were down on a national level. Consumer confidence was down, and the Dow Jones was down significantly as well when you just look back to February. So this slide essentially represents, kind of a global view of general fund revenues from January to where we're sitting today. And you can see that development fees were at, just south of 14 million at 13.7 million. We're now forecasting $9 million for fiscal year 2021. That drop, that 34% drop, is in line with, the last couple of recessions actually. When we look at sales tax, that 20.7% drop from the previous forecast is again in line with recessionary impacts, liquor tax, so on and so forth. Bottom line, from where we were sitting back in January, we were assuming revenues of $257 million within the general fund. We're now looking at closer to $243 million, about a 5.5% drop. So now I'll kind of get into a category by category view. When you look at the development fees, again, we were at 13.7 million, now forecasting approximately 9 million. That number is, along the lines of where we were in 2014, 2015. And we were seeing, steady growth. But that,
I'm sorry, Eric, what number was in line with 2014, 2015?
Sorry, the $9 million, the $9 million estimate we have in for fiscal year 2021. Sorry.
No, it was me. It was me.
Okay, for development fees. So, again, this is one of those categories that we tend to see very immediate effects. The first half of this fiscal year, as discussed last week, was coming in quite strong. We think that this year we probably will end within budget. In January, we had increased our revenue estimate for fiscal year 2021 to reflect the activity that we were seeing, last fiscal year and the first half of this fiscal year, which we're now going to need to adjust. When we look at sales tax, we were assuming $21.7 million for January, back in January for next fiscal year. Now we're looking, somewhere around 17.5 million, approximately a 20% reduction. Now, if you look at the forecasted numbers, you'll see growth rates in fiscal years 22, 23, and 24 of 3%. And we had, there had been discussion about a cap of 1% growth in sales tax. Now, the reason that that number exceeds 1% in those years is because the cap that we are held to per state legislation passed this year is based on fiscal year 2019 or fiscal year 2020, but the state's fiscal year, and the state fiscal year ends in June. So while we are building in our current fiscal year essentially 2 really rough quarters due to this coronavirus impact, the state fiscal year, and therefore our cap, only has one of those quarters. So we should be able to pick up some growth in the outer years. And I've built in a modest growth of approximately 3%. If you look back the last several years, the statewide pool has grown about 5.5%, just south of that, I think about 5.4%. So, we have captured growth. In fiscal year 2025, we've brought that number down to 2.5%, which really equates to 1% growth if you were to annualize based on the cap that we would anticipate being at due to the fiscal year 2020 state collection. I might pause.
Could I ask a question?
Sorry, yes, I was muted. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Eric, so I appreciate that explanation because I was going to ask, it seemed like a higher growth rate than we'd be allowed under the legislation. But I think what I'm hearing you say is by the time we get to 2025, and again, depending on what the fiscal year for the state is and where we will be capped at 1%, beyond that, our sales tax growth would probably level off at 1% under this current legislation. Is that correct?
It is correct. It will depend at that time where the per capita distribution. So it's going to really depend on where population sits for the city of Boise versus the rest of the state at that point in time. And as we modeled this previously, it looked like we were going to see years where we would be at 1%, and then the next year we might catch some growth, and then the next year after we'd have to go back down to 1%. But I guess in spirit, yes, starting in fiscal year 2025 is when we're going to hit that number, and we're probably going to fluctuate at that point.
Okay. So given the experience of the last recession, about the time when we'd be able to catch some real growth and maybe catch up on things, we'll be capped.
That is correct.
Potentially. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you.
It's my hope that with, I don't want to just say hope, but we're seeing, there were concerns about the impact of the sales tax legislation, what it would do. And given that I think many cities will be in our boat, it begs another, like a continued conversation with whether or not these were the right changes given the new world that we're in.
Madam Mayor?
Mm-hmm.
Eric? Eric?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for all this information. I know we've only been in this situation for a few months now, but are we able to determine how this is going to affect people moving into the area, or if it's going to?
I certainly have spent time thinking about that. It's a difficult one to project, and I think it's really going to depend, if you were to ask me, on what the national economy looks like, to the degree that, folks are experiencing turmoil in other parts of the country and are able to, potentially sell their home and come here for a lower priced home. I think it's going to depend on real estate markets and a lot of other things, what the affordability of this area looks like. I think to the degree that we saw on one of the previous slides, housing starts coming down. If that is a theme that we see in the local area and supply is limited, it might inhibit folks from being able to move here because the cost might be prohibitive. I think it's a little early to tell, but it's certainly something that we're going to be looking very closely at.
Thank you, Eric. Do you know at what point we would be able to that?
I'm sorry, council member. I didn't quite catch that question.
I'm sorry. Do you know at what point we should be able to gauge that? To gauge whether or not it's going to be having an effect moving in?
I apologize for this answer. That's also a difficult question to answer. I think to the degree that this crisis that we're in stabilizes at some point, in the next, handful of months, and we start to return to some degree of normalcy, or maybe the shock to the economy that we're seeing starts to wear off, and we start to see some more sustainable patterns, I think we might be able to project a little bit better.
Thank you, Eric. I know for myself, my own family in the early 80s, it was the recession that brought us to Idaho. So that's I was assuming we were able to tell if we're actually going to be getting even more people coming to Idaho, coming to Boise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I won't dwell too much on liquor tax. I talked a little bit about that one. That one, historically has been largely shielded from recessionary impacts. There is a bit of a lag effect from when we get the revenue. And I would anticipate that our fiscal year 2021 number would be somewhat impacted due to the restaurants and the bars being closed, or potential different regulations around reduced capacity. It's not difficult to envision lots of different scenarios being at play there. The other interesting thing about liquor tax is this one has been impacted by prior state legislation, which we have included in our outer year forecasts, which essentially diverted revenues that we otherwise would have been receiving to support municipal court services. That revenue diversion comes with offsetting savings to the city, but the growth rates in the outer years are somewhat depressed, and then we would anticipate picking up some growth, we see in fiscal years 24 and 25. Franchise fees is a category that, almost as far back as I look, has been relatively stable. Now, there's been certainly volatility amongst the four categories that we receive franchise fees for: garbage, water, gas, and cable. We've certainly seen gas and particularly cable decline in recent years. But offsetting that have been garbage and water increases. And I have no reason to project anything different. The background for this slide is we have continued to, draw down in our estimates the amount that we would expect to see from gas and cable, with some offsetting increases in those other areas.
Madam Mayor,
I have a question for you, Eric. On the franchise fees, it comes to my mind in that, these utilities, Auto Power and the others are allowing folks that can't pay their bill some leniency. Is that going to have an impact on the franchise fees? Maybe a short-term reduction? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Thompson. Within the current fiscal year, to the degree that payments span on fiscal year 2020 into fiscal year 2021, it could have an impact on current year collections. I haven't seen any utilities saying they're going to forgive payment. I've seen, we're not going to stop service, or we're not going to, put you into collections if you don't pay on time. So in my assumptions, I have not modeled, a true reduction, but it certainly could have a cash flow issue from one year to the next. And we will certainly be monitoring if we do hear, any of the utilities saying that, payment will be forgiven.
Thank you.
So departmental revenue is a category that really encompasses a whole bunch of different things. It's revenue above and beyond kind of the traditional tax categories that departments provide service for, or that they collect, to offset some cost that they provide. So some of the categories: business licenses. We provide services for other agencies, whether it be our public safety services. Both police and fire provide services to the airport, and the fire department provides services to Whitney and NACFR and other fire protection districts. The police provides a service to BSU. When you look at our legal department, they provide prosecutorial services on behalf of the city of Meridian, for which we are reimbursed. Our parking revenue outside of citations is captured within this category. Our library consortium, and then we have a whole series of parks and recreation revenues that are accounted for within this category: golf, ice world, zoo, aquatics, our day camps, our summer day camps, pretty much any parks and recreation service that you can think of would be captured within this category. So as we look at, fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021, fiscal year 2020 is the very light blue shaded category. And you can see the reduction that we are assuming within the current fiscal year of about just under $6.3 million. And next year, in the darker blue, about $2.8 million. The reason for that vast disparity is we have assumed in fiscal year 2020, or we have allowed for in fiscal year 2020, facility closures. So to the degree that, the golf courses are closed, or Idaho Ice World, or any of those other facilities, and we're not receiving any revenue, that has a very severe impact. Within fiscal year 2021, we have allowed for certainly a recession. Within our revenue estimates, we have not assumed long-standing facility closures. Next week, we will talk about how we might address if there were to be instances like that within fiscal year 2021. We're kind of in the middle of developing a plan for that. When we look at the categories and the impacts, Parks and Recreation is probably the category that has the most severe impact from a dollar-wise perspective. The other one that we've built in some pretty significant declines for would be parking. When you look at our parking, there's a lot of different things to account for, to the degree that people have, income to come and visit our restaurants and various events. Employment, certainly plays a part in that. So we have reduced our estimate for parking accordingly. So I'll now get into property tax. So with property tax, it's obviously our most significant revenue category. It makes up about 2/3 of our general fund revenues. Within fiscal year 2020, our budgeted amount was just under $160 million. So as you look at property tax, there's really two ways to increase year-over-year collections. The first being annual base increases, and per state law, we cannot increase above 3%. The second being growth from new payers. So as there is new construction or properties annexed into the city, you can collect property tax from those two factors.
Eric, have you moved the slide forward? Sorry, Madam Mayor.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. So with the annual base increases, it's really city council discretion as to what level of an increase that might be taken in any particular year. Generally, we nexus those base increases to cost increases for our existing services. And when we look at new construction and annexation, again, city council discretion, it is based on the prior year activity. So for us, when we look at our new construction and annexation, there's very little forecasting to do because we have received, at least for the most immediate year that we're facing, because we have received information from the county outlining the estimated value of new construction that occurred between January 1st and December 31st of calendar year 2019. And we like to think of new construction and annexation as the way that growth pays for growth. So new payers paying for new services.
Madam Mayor,
Sure,
Eric,
go ahead, Councilman.
this is a question I should know the answer to, but in terms of the 3%, is it council discretion to take up to 3% of last year's base? Is that the way it works? It's 3% of what, I guess is the question.
Thank you very much, Councilmember. The 3% cap is based on last year's total budget. So it would be the prior year's base plus any new construction that was included in that fiscal year.
So yeah, my question is then, does not taking the 3% produce a downstream effect basically forever? Because if you take 1%, then that's 2% of base that you didn't get, and that's not available to be added to the base next year. You see what I'm saying? It's kind of like the inverse of what we all hope happens in a IRA or a 401k.
Thank you very much, Councilmember, for that question. That is correct. There is the ability, state law does allow localities to claim any amounts taken or not taken, claim it as foregone. So essentially crediting that revenue, and crediting is probably not the right word, reserving the ability in future years to go back and get anything that wasn't taken in a prior fiscal year. And there has been legislation around that, essentially, requiring at the time within the fiscal year that a council might elect to not take the full amount, requiring them to preserve that ability through the foregone in a maybe a different way than in the past.
Thank you very much. I'm kind of embarrassed that I didn't know the answer to that question already. I appreciate it.
It's a good question.
Don't be.
So on this slide, I just tried to capture kind of the financial impacts of new construction and annexation. So as we look at the new construction and annexation number, it's just over $500 million for calendar year 2019, which is a record number. So it was a very strong year in terms of growth in calendar year 2019. With that, we'd expect to see, costs, and we will certainly talk about those costs, over the course of this budget development cycle. But that $2.9 million translates to approximately 1.8% growth from the prior year. Then what I've done is I've outlined for every 0.5% up to the 3%, how much cumulative growth the city could realize in terms of property tax, what the year-over-year growth would be from a percentage basis, and what the impact to the average homeowner would be. That impact to the average homeowner number is, there's a chart that we include in our budget document every year where we try and demonstrate what the impact would be to the average homeowner based on any optional increase to increase property tax versus how much is attributable to burden shift due to kind of the formula for property tax. So as the mayor mentioned, the allowance right now in our forecast is for a 2% increase. And you can see on this line right here, you know, when factoring that in with, on this third line from the bottom, when factoring in the new construction and annexation, it would translate to about a 3.8% overall growth number and have an estimated impact of approximately almost $27 on the average homeowner.
Madam Mayor, Eric, what
Sure.
value are you using for the home value for the average homeowner?
Thank you very much, Councilmember, for asking that question. That number is still being developed. We're getting some of those specific numbers from the county. And so we base that average number on the county number, which they have, told us that they would get to us within, the next couple of weeks. So these numbers are based on kind of the calculation we did last year, which was approximately, I think, $330,000 for the average home. So this next slide demonstrates our new construction and annexation forecast from the month of January. So the orange line representing, the orange portion of this line representing fiscal year 2021 and the outer years. And you can see in fiscal year 2021, we had estimated a very strong $455 million. And what actually happened was the number that we got from the county of the preliminary number of $510 million. So we have increased that number, but in the outer years, we have built in more of a decline. Now, the interesting thing is, we would project that somewhat leveling off. And when you look at fiscal year 2025 in both of the models, they're fairly close. 299 million in the prior model, 294 million in the current model.
Eric, this is Lauren. I guess I don't need to say that, sorry. When you say the prior models, refresh me on what that is. So the model pre-COVID that you were running before, because we projected at some point some sort of recession, and the model that we're running compared to the model that we're running now is 294 versus 299.
Thank you, Mary. Yes, that's correct. So the outer year, so for fiscal year 2025, the pre-COVID versus the post-COVID models are very similar, but in the more immediate years, you can see that orange line looks quite different. So in January, it was more level. We have more of a sharp drop off attributable to this event.
Okay.
Madam Mayor.
Go ahead.
Eric, how does this drop off the steepness of it compare to what we saw in the Great Recession? I know that was a different recession. It was really focused on building. And so we saw a very steep drop off. So that's why I'm curious.
Is that what the 2009 number?
So is that what we're seeing back there? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Mayor, Councilmember Clegg. Yes, the Great Recession number is demonstrated on the left-hand portion of this slide.
That's right, because it lagged for 2 years. Yeah.
Right. So we're certainly going to have to evaluate our assumptions going forward. And that's kind of, to the point that I was trying to make earlier. As we understand the duration of this event, the severity and the impacts, we may need to, adjust, whether it be up or down, our new construction estimates.
Yeah.
So, going to the base increase, on that previous slide, you could see for every 0.5% that is not taken, our revenues would be reduced by approximately $800,000. So within our draft forecast, we have built in something less than the max available increase, and as the mayor mentioned at the outset, that is, in large recognition of kind of the challenging economic environment that many of our residents are facing. One thing that I will note would be, the theme of burden shift, which has been discussed at length over the last several years.
The theme of what?
The theme of burden shift
Burden.
between commercial to residential. That theme will probably remain. The county has indicated that once again, residential properties on average grew at a higher percentage than commercial properties. And the homeowner's exemption, yet again, is frozen at that $100,000 level. So we would anticipate there being, some degree of additional burden shift due to those state legislative factors.
Madam Mayor. Eric, do you think that there's a possibility it will even be bigger, given the impacts of COVID are so enormous on the small business sector, and so much of that business tax might be more impacted even than it would have been otherwise, whereas homes probably won't decrease in value. They may not gain as much.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Clay. That's a very good question, very good point. I would anticipate that we wouldn't necessarily see that the impact from COVID this go round, because the assessments are based on January 1. But next year, once the impacts of this event have filtered through and those are caught in the assessments, we very, very, very well may see exactly what you're talking about. So again, the 2% increase is 2/3 of the maximum allowed amount, and $1.6 million lower than we could have built into our forecast. I have one more slide, and I'd be happy to stand for any questions on any of this. Just in terms of upcoming budget milestones, next week I'll be with you again, and we are going to talk about, kind of the proposed expenditure strategy and seek feedback and discussion on what we've developed to date. In June, we'll be releasing the budget document. Depending on how next week goes, I could envision, us being before you to talk about budget items, a handful of more times between now and June. The budget workshop in June, towards the end, and then our public hearing the third week in July. One thing I will note is that the budget document that you will be receiving in June is going to be significantly thinner than it has been in the past. And we talked about that previously. This was even before the COVID event occurred, due to the many moving factors that we had at one point in time. Things were very tenuous regarding our property tax as we looked at potential state legislation. And then as we were monitoring the sales tax situation, it was kind of a nice perfect storm to have that event dovetail into this COVID event. So our budget document will probably be, quite thin and hit on, the high points, and we'll fill in, gaps as we go. That is the end of my my prepared deck, but I'd be happy to stand for any questions the council might have.
Hi, I just, somebody asked me to mention, and I wanted to mention the public engagement piece. So we are still trying to come up with a schedule that makes sense. First off, today, we're looking at revenues. During next week, we'll start looking at expenses. And then I think some of the proposals around revenue will make sense. But it's still important to ensure that we hear from the public. And while it's different than all of us, when we talked earlier in the year, we envisioned a different kind of public engagement process. Staff is working on a survey, and then we'll determine whether or not, and I think we ought to try potentially some Zoom kind of town halls to hear from people, give people the opportunity to see this, and not this specifically, but the overall picture, and then answer questions that we put out before them, just using some of the new community engagement tools that we're all getting used to using.
Madam Mayor.
Councilman?
So this is probably a much too simplified vision of the budget to ask, but I'm curious when I really appreciate the idea of asking for 2% and instead of 3%, and trying to recognize the burden that so many people in our community are facing with the loss of income and so many other things. I'm curious if we are seeing any other cities or any other ways of using the budget where you would take the additional 1% and try to use those funds strategically in an equitable way to invest in services that would serve our most vulnerable community members. And again, I know that that's kind of an overgeneralization on how the budget works, but I'm wondering if we're seeing any models where cities are exploring those types of things instead of not taking the extra 1%.
I'll jump in. I haven't seen any models from Idaho cities. Not all. It's very few places that are constrained the way we are. But the expense proposals, and when the departments look at what's next, a lens around equity and investment to ensure that we recover well is going to be central to the decisions that they're making and the proposals they bring before us for the budget, rather than saying, well, we're going to save this 1% for X. That's going to be, we're going to be looking at how we use all of the revenue that we have to strategically address the needs of the community, given where we're at today.
And I guess, Madam Mayor, just to follow up with that. So I guess I would be curious, and again, I know this is very simplified, but if we were going to the public and we were asking the public to weigh in on what their thoughts were with the budget, if there would be a way of letting people know, if we take the additional money, here are some of the things that money could be used for if we take it. And if there are ways of modeling that in a way that serves our most vulnerable community members and really tries to level out some of the inequity as far as the way that people have been affected by this pandemic.
I think I don't have a perfect answer for you. There are, in any public engagement process we do in the budget process, it'll be clear what we're proposing the departments spend the money on, whether it be 2%, 3%, 1% that we take. I'm recognizing that we've got people to take care of, both internally and then a community at large that needs investments to respond to COVID. And we've put quite an emphasis already, and the revenues that the additional costs related to COVID that we will likely incur are in much part due to programs that we're developing to support those most vulnerable if we have to deploy to help them. And that ultimately factors itself into the budget too.
Madam Mayor?
Yeah, go ahead.
If I can follow up on that. As you were beginning to build the budget back in January, we were talking about scenarios and how much would get spent and how much would get collected and what would happen with them. It occurs to me that potentially we could build at least one scenario beyond what is being proposed for the budget overall that would include extra revenue if we took the 1% and what we might be able to do with that. I, for one, think it would be worth investigating how difficult it would be to produce that. It doesn't mean that we would necessarily take it, but I think it might daylight some of the things that we've already determined our priorities and how and if we could take them farther if there were more funding. And even if we don't end up with that more funding, sometimes just getting those ideas on the table can be really valuable for bringing forward other folks who might figure out ways to do them.
Mhm.
So I guess I would propose that if we could, it might be a good idea.
And that's something I'll talk with the finance team about. They've put together the impact of 3, 2, 1, all the different ones. And so yes, we could throw some, when we talk about expenses is where you see that more. And I think they've done a great job so far at balancing when we talked in January, we talked about all the money that they had already, because they're so good fiscally, found for us to save. So that then we could clearly point out the value of the investments we are making, or have more flexibility in responding to the public's hardship around affordability right now by dropping it. Now we have this. And so, this isn't about just cutting, as I said before, it's about making sure that each department, and what you'll see in this budget that's a little different, is it won't, we're going to give them time because of the unique situation that we're in to come up with the programs that need to be funded. I don't want to see just a 2% cut or a 5-6% cut, but instead this is where we must reprioritize department by department and make sure that with the funding that we have, we're making investments that respond to where we're at and how the world will be different when we move through this, and the need for us to be smart about how we recover. But there's no reason not to, when we talk about the revenue piece, look at the impact of a couple different numbers.
Madam Mayor,
Go ahead.
I really appreciate Councilmember Halliburton bringing up that possibility of that scenario, and also Councilmember Clegg supported that as well. The reason I asked about whether or not we anticipated that we would continue to have people moving into the Boise area, even though we've got this pandemic to deal with. And again, I just refer back to my own personal experience, having moved from one part of the country to another in response to a recession. And when my family moved, we moved because we had family in Idaho. We didn't, there was not work. It was not about a house being available. It was about having that familial support. And I don't know how the fact that we have this virus and we don't want people cohabitating and crossing those boundaries and possibly infecting each other. But again, I don't know. We don't know how long this is going to last. But my concern is that we possibly have folks move into who are going to be needing resources from us. And so I do appreciate the possibility of.
You're blipping out. I'm wondering if you could turn off your camera maybe, to see if it gives you more bandwidth so we can hear you clearly.
Let's see. Is this better?
Just while you're talking, yeah, it seems to be a trick.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mayor. So basically, yeah, that's why I asked about, whether or not we anticipate having that same stream of folks moving into the areas. My concern is that we're going to have more folks who are just wanting to be with family. Maybe things are not going to be working out where they're currently living. and wanting to join resources, and then putting that burden on our community. So I do appreciate the possibility of us looking at a scenario where we do take that extra 1% and use that to support possibly new Boiseans. Thank you.
Madam Mayor.
Councilman Thompson.
Eric, one piece of information that I would be interested in seeing as we get closer is what the other 5 cities are doing within Ada County, even if this is to us in a memo in terms of the 3%. And it's the first time I've ever really been interested. And it's not because I'll base my decision on what CUNA's doing or what Eagle's doing, because we all have different needs, priorities, and visions for our cities. But we are all in this together. This virus is impacting citizens in Ada County equally, for the most part. And I'm just curious what they're going to be doing, specifically just the other 5, what they're going to do, and if they come up with a creative solution that hasn't been mentioned here, that we might be able to lean on as well. Thanks.
Councilmember.
I didn't see who that was.
It's Holly.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Right in my screen, sorry.
No, you're fine. My question is about the outreach plan. You had mentioned earlier that we were looking at some of the newer technology solutions that we've been using for meetings like these. Just for kind of posterity, what are the other ways that people might be reached out to so that people who don't have access to technology will also be able to participate?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure if we have the plan here in listed slides, but because it's actually super draft right now. What we're trying to, what's been thrown out there are the options of providing survey access, which again, that's like, you've got to have a computer. So that's where I'm stammering a little bit. So we've talked about Zoom, we've talked about survey access. I'm looking at using In the Know. Some of the more like the things that have been done in the past versus what was going to be different was actually going out and being with people. So if okay with you, because that wasn't totally put together for today, we will have more of that as part of the presentation next week. And if there are suggestions that you have to make sure that we can connect with people that don't have this kind of access as well, please let us know.
Yeah, that's
You know,
great.
it's interesting. I've been asked more and more lately if we would consider keeping this available even when we're all back in City Hall, because it does open up accessibility to City Council meetings for people that aren't necessarily able to show up for a whole variety of reasons. And so I see this as something that we've gotten used to using that we'll probably use more of. And the city is looking at making that possible long term. But then but you're right, we need to figure out other ways to connect with people that aren't necessarily on Zoom or taking online surveys.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone thinking about that, because I think access is super important, and using technology is awesome, but just recognizing that not everyone has access, I think will be a little bit more equitable.
Madam Mayor, can I just add one thought?
Of course.
So going back to the scenarios discussion, certainly next week when we have this discussion, I can, and we have many scenarios, you know, somewhat built, and I can refine those and bring different options. The one thing that, not to tip our hand too much, but next week when we talk about this would be some of the investments, you know, or investment categories we have broadly defined, you know, kind of dollar amounts around them. Because this COVID event, we want to allow some level of time to see what the true impacts are. And once we have a better understanding of the base implications, potentially come back to the council for more specific directions. So when I bring those scenarios back, and I can put them into buckets, but they will probably be higher level than kind of the more granular buckets that normally I would like to bring.
Madam Mayor. Eric, I appreciate that explanation. I would have expected that. I think, as you noted at the beginning of your presentation, we're going to have to be flexible probably all year, and we'll probably have some big budget categories that over the year we'll refine in terms of exactly how and where we'll spend them, but knowing that at least we've perhaps put enough aside for whatever those needs may end up being. I guess that's how I interpreted your opening remarks. So if that's right, then thank you for that clarification.
Great. Well, thank you, Eric. We appreciate the presentation. And we don't have an executive session, so we're now breaking for our own dinners at home. And it's the same for all of us. Who's in charge of the technology? Do we just call into the same Zoom link?
It's the same Zoom link as this one.
Okay. Great. So we'll see you all back here in half an hour. Elaine, you're muted. Oh, sorry, Council President, you're muted.
Sorry, that's
I can
fine.
see you, so I can see you talking. I can't
Yeah,
see
I
everybody
appreciate
all at
that.
once right now.
Matt, can we just leave the Zoom open, or should we close it and come back?
You can leave it open if you'd like. Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.